Whenever HOYOverse releases a new major region for Genshin, they generally introduce a unique overarching theme or game mechanic that influences the kit design of many of those regions' characters. For example, Sumeru introduced the Dendro element, Fontaine played around HP change, and Nodlan revolved around Night Soul. Now for the Song of the Welcome Moon arc of Genshin's story, which introduces Nod-Krai, the major novel game mechanic for the region is Lunar Reactions. Lunar Reactions modify and enhance some of the game's existing reactions when certain characters are present on your team. There are currently 3 types of lunar reactions: Lunar-Charged, which replaces Electro-Charged, Lunar-Bloom, which replaces Bloom, and Lunar-Crystallize, which replaces Hydro-Crystallize. Additional lunar reactions may or may not be added in the future. While most of the lunar-related 5-star characters can only enable the one reaction they are designed for, Columbina, who serves as the Archon character of Nod-Krai, can enable the use of all 3 lunar reactions when she's on the team. So with the release, understanding the ins and outs of lunar reactions has only gotten even more important. So let's go over each of the 3 lunar reactions in detail to get a better understanding of Nod-Krai's key mechanic. This explanation is taken from my comprehensive guide about Columbina. If you're interested on everything related to Columbina, such as her best builds and teams, I highly suggest checking it out. If you already have, thank you. This lunar reaction video isn't going to be much different than my coverage of lunar reactions in my Columbina guide. This only serves to be a separate source of info on just the lunar reactions to make it easier for people to find. First, we have Lunar-Charged. Now normally, when you apply Hydro and Electro on an enemy, Electro-Charged is triggered. When this happens, the enemy will have an Electro-Charged aura where they are affected by Hydro and Electro simultaneously. The Electro-Charged target will take Electro damage every second alongside any nearby enemies that are also affected by Hydro. Each tick of damage consumes both the Hydro and Electro auras, and the damage will stop when one of the auras is depleted. Electro-Charged is a transformative reaction, so the damage scales with the character's level and elemental mastery while being affected by the enemy's electro res. It ignores enemy's defense but can't crit and isn't buffed by elemental damage percent. The character who applies Hydro or Electro last will take ownership of the reaction, and thus the game will use their stats to calculate the damage of the reaction. So if you apply Hydro then Electro, only the Electro character stats like their level and EM will determine the damage. But if the opposite happens, then the Hydro character will take ownership of the reaction, leading to inconsistent reaction ownership. This is one of the main reasons why Electro-Charged teams don't have their Hydro or Electro units built full EM to maximize the reaction damage. Since either the Hydro or Electro character can trigger the reaction, both need to be built full EM to ensure the Electro-Charged reaction is buffed by any EM built. But if you build both units full EM, you lose a ton of damage from their talents because you aren't building stats like crit and attack or HP depending on what they scale with. An on-field Animal Driver can circumvent this problem, however, because when they trigger Swirl, they can be the ones to trigger most of the Electro-Charged reactions. And this is why Taser teams with Animal Drivers are the only ones who build full EM on the team. Lunar-Charged, however, works differently. When you apply Hydro and Electro onto an enemy while Enefa, Flins, or Columbina is on a team, a Thundercloud will spawn and persist for 6 seconds, refreshing its duration when the reaction is triggered again. This Thundercloud will deal Electro damage to enemies affected by both Hydro and Electro every 2 seconds. Unlike Electro-Charged, which can deal AoE damage with each damage tick, each Lunar-Charged reaction hits a single enemy. Lunar-Charged shares characteristics of a standard transformative reaction, but it also scales with the character's crit stats. And unlike other reactions which calculate the damage using the stats of the character who just triggers the reaction, Lunar-Charged counts every character that participates. The Lunar-Charged reaction deals damage every 2 seconds. Within each 2-second time frame, the game will check which characters have provided Hydro or Electro auras onto an enemy and considers them as contributors to the reaction. Swirls are of course included, and since elemental auras are what matters, one elemental application can technically allow a unit to partake in 2 Lunar-Charged procs. To give an example showing how Lunar-Charged works, if you have 2 Electro units and 2 Hydro units that have applied their elements onto an enemy to trigger Lunar-Charged, all of them will share the reaction ownership. Once the game sees which characters are taking part in the reaction, it will calculate the individual Lunar-Charged reaction damage for each character using their stats with its damage formula. To briefly summarize the key components, the reaction damage scales with character level, the base reaction damage buff from character passives. For Lunar-Charged, there is 14% from both Enefa's and Flynn's passive and 7% from Columbina's, elemental mastery, lunar reaction damage bonus but not elemental damage bonus, enemy electro res but not their defense, a character's crit stats, and lastly elevation, which is a special and potent stat buff that comes from 5-star character constellations. constellations. So for every character that provides Hydro or Electro within 2 seconds, a damage number for the reaction will be calced for each of them. Then, to get the final damage of the reaction, the game adds up all the individual numbers. However, only the highest damage number gets full value. The second highest number gets halved, and the third and fourth highest damage numbers, if there are 3 or 4 total characters that contributed to the reaction, gets multiplied by 1/12 before getting summed up. So most of the damage comes from the top 2 contributors, which will generally be the characters with the most crit and EM. Do keep in mind that because of crit variance, the ranking of contributors toward the Lunar-Charged reaction can change depending on whether or not an individual crits or not, resulting in some variability in the reaction damage. So while normal Electrocharge is a transformative reaction that can deal AoE damage every second and calcs the damage from the one character triggering the reaction, Lunar-Charged shares properties of a standard transformative reaction, dealing single target damage every 2 seconds, but it takes into account a character's crit stats and allows all characters that have applied Hydro or Electro to take part in the reaction, meaning that its damage isn't calced from the stats of one character. When you compare the reaction damage of Lunar-Charged with the reaction damage of Electrocharge when optimized with Elemental Mastery, both are relatively similar. However, it's really only Taser teams with an Anemo driver that build full EM to maximize Electrocharge damage. In most other teams, the Hydro and Electro units, especially main DPSs, aren't building much EM to optimize for Electrocharge damage, but stats like crit to increase their talent damage. In this scenario, Lunar-Charge is significantly better than Electrocharge since Lunar-Charge scales with crit. You're pretty much getting free damage by building your characters normally. So in most relevant meta teams, Lunar-Charge is a strict upgrade over regular Electrocharged. But applying elements to trigger a Lunar-Charge reaction isn't the only way to deal Lunar-Charge damage. Certain character abilities, such as from Anefa, Flins, and Columbina, can directly deal Lunar-Charge damage. This damage doesn't apply any element, but the damage formula is very similar to the formula for Lunar-Charge reaction damage, so it scales with mostly the same stats. But instead of scaling with character level, it just takes into account the abilities multiplier and stat scaling. Flins and Anefa's talents and abilities scale with attack, while Columbina scales with HP. In addition, the damage of direct Lunar-Charge has a special multiplier of 3. Also, any additive extra damage is added before accounting for enemy Electro-Res, crit, and elevation, but there are currently no additive damage buffs for Lunar-Charge damage. For characters that have direct Lunar-Charge damage in their kit, it will generally be their main significant source of damage. Second, we have Lunar-Bloom. Normally, when you apply Hydro and Dendro on an enemy, you trigger Bloom and spawn a Bloom core, where Dendro is the strong aura of the reaction. The core will explode after 6 seconds, but you can apply Electro on the core to trigger Hyper Bloom, apply Pyro on the core to trigger Burgeon, or if you have Nilou to make the Bloom cores bountiful cores, any Dendro cores made will immediately explode. When Lalma, Nefer, or Columbina is on a team and you apply Hydro and Dendro on an enemy, you trigger Lunar-Bloom. But nothing really drastically changes with the reaction compared to normal Bloom. You still get a Bloom core, the core still interacts with Electro, Pyro, and Nilou the same way, and the damage of Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Burgeon is the exact same as it is normally, and this fact is very important to realize. Even though you trigger Lunar Blooms when creating Dendro cores with Lalma, Nefer, or Columbina on a team, there is no new Lunar Bloom damage coming from the actual reactions. Lunar Bloom damage only exists as direct damage from certain character abilities, such as from Lalma, Nefer, and Columbina, so this damage doesn't apply any element and will account for the abilities multiplier and stat scaling. Lalma and Nefer's talents and abilities scale with EM, while Columbina scale with HP. Base reaction damage buffs from character passives also increase Lunar Bloom damage. For Lunar Bloom, there's 14% from both Lalma's and Nefer's passives and 7% from Columbina's. Direct Lunar Bloom damage also has additional EM scaling and is buffed by Lunar reaction damage bonus, but not regular damage bonus like elemental damage bonus. Then, any additive extra damage, such as the Quill-like buffs from Lalma's burst, are added before taking into account enemy Dendro res but not defense, crit, and elevation from constellations. Thus, even with Lalma, Nefer, or Columbina on a team, Bloom cores exploding on their own or with Nilou is still regular Bloom damage, proccing Hyper Bloom still results in regular Hyper Bloom damage, and proccing Burgeon is still regular Burgeon damage. So how does Lunar Bloom differ from normal Bloom? The only thing that's different is that when you trigger Lunar Bloom to create a Dendro core, after 2.5 seconds you obtain 1 Verdant Dew, and any Lunar Blooms triggered within that 2.5 seconds will lead to partial generation of the next Verdant Dew. To visualize the mechanics of this, let's say you trigger Lunar Bloom 1 second after you proc the first one. At this time, there is 1.5 seconds remaining on the first Dew, but the timer of the second Dew from the second Lunar Blooms already starts ticking while the first one is still being made. So when the next Dew actually starts generating, you'll only get 1 second out of the 2.5 seconds needed because the other 1.5 seconds was used up while waiting on the first Dew to be completely made. Thus, you can't just trigger 6 instances of Lunar Bloom to get 6 Verdant Dews, for instance. You are ultimately limited by each Dew needing 2.5 seconds to be made, so you need consistent Dendro and Hydro application at the proper timings for continual Dew generation, being able to hold a max of 3 Verdant Dews at a baseline. Verdant Dews don't do anything on their own. They only serve as key resources used in specifically Lalma's, Nefer's, and Columbina's kits. Third, we have Lunar-Crystallize. Normally, when an enemy is affected by Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, and then you apply Geo, regular Crystallize will trigger, spawning a shard on the field you can pick up for a small shield that scales with the level and elemental mastery of the Geo unit who triggered the reaction. This can be somewhat helpful for interruption resistance or to enable Geo resonance and artifact sets like Archaic Petra, but ultimately it isn't really a good reaction. But when you have Zibai or Columbina on the team, you can access Lunar-Crystallize. Lunar-Crystallize only works when Geo reacts with Hydro. Other elements will only trigger regular Crystallize, not the Lunar version. Once Hydro plus Geo happens, instead of spawning a Crystallize shard, 3 Moondrifts will spawn surrounding the enemy, each acting as a Geo construct, but they won't be taken into account in the regular Geo construct limit of 3. So the Moondrifts spawned from Lunar-Crystallize will activate Giori second dulls as they count as a construct, and Zhongli can still place his pillar on the field with the 3 Moondrifts present, allowing all 4 constructs to resonate. Once you trigger Lunar-Crystallize a total of 3 times, each of the Moondrifts will fire an attack on the enemy, and this is called Moondrift Harmony. Each of these attacks are single target. So for example, you trigger one Lunar-Crystallize at the start of the battle, you spawn the Moondrifts. You trigger a second one, nothing happens. Then you trigger a third Lunar-Crystallize, and the 3 Moondrifts will each fire an attack on the enemy. Afterwards, the Moondrifts still stay on the field, but after another 3 Lunar-Crystallizes, they will each fire again, and so on. So 3 Lunar-Crystallize reactions equals damage. If enemies do move out of range, more copies of Moondrifts will spawn when triggering another Lunar-Crystallize reaction closer to where the enemy now is, and the attacks will just come from the 3 nearest Moondrifts to the enemy. Now normally, Crystallize has a 1-second global ICD, meaning that even with all the Hydro and Geo application in the world, you could only trigger a maximum of 1 Crystallize reaction every second. But with Lunar-Crystallize, this global ICD has reportedly been removed. As a result, teams can trigger more Lunar-Crystallize reactions, allowing for more damage from the Moondrifts. How Lunar-Crystallize's reaction damage is calculated works very similarly to Lunar-Charged. Instead of having a single character being a trigger for the reaction, with only their stats scaling the damage, Lunar-Crystallize counts every character that participates in the reaction. Since you need 3 Lunar-Crystallizes before the reaction deals damage, the game will track which characters contributed a Hydro Aura or applied Geo for those 3 reactions. For instance, if you have one unit applying a Hydro Aura and 3 Geo units that each trigger 1 Lunar-Crystallize when they apply Geo, all of them will share reaction ownership for 1 instance of reaction damage. Once the game sees which characters are taking part in the reaction, it will calculate the individual Lunar-Crystallize damage for each character using their stats with the damage formula. To briefly summarize the key parts, the reaction damage scales with character level. The base reaction damage buff from character passives. For Lunar-Crystallize, there's 14% from Zibai's passive and 7% from Columbina's. Elemental Mastery, Lunar reaction damage bonus but not elemental damage bonus. Enemy Geo res but not their defense. A character's crit stats, and lastly Elevation, which is a special and potent stat buff that comes from 5-star character constellations. So for every character that provided a Hydro Aura and applied Geo to trigger the 3 Lunar-Crystallize reactions, a damage number for the reaction will be calculated for each of them. Then to get the final damage of the reaction, the game adds up all the individual numbers. However, just like Lunar-Charged, only the highest damage number gets full value. The second highest number gets halved, and the third and fourth highest damage numbers, if there are 3 or 4 total characters that contributed to the reaction, gets multiplied by 1/12 before getting summed up. As a result, most of the damage comes from the top 2 contributors, which will generally be the characters with the most crit and EM. But of course, because of crit variance, the ranking of contributors toward the Lunar-Crystallize reaction can slightly change depending on whether or not an individual character crits or not, resulting in some variability in the reaction damage. And just like the other 2 Lunar reactions, certain character abilities such as from Zibai and Columbina can deal direct Lunar-Crystallize damage. This damage also doesn't apply any element, and the damage formula is very similar to the formula for Lunar-Crystallize reaction damage, so it scales with mostly the same stats. But instead of scaling with character level, it just takes into account the abilities multiplier and stat scaling. Zibai's talents and abilities scale with defense, while Columbina's scale with HP. In addition, the damage of direct Lunar-Crystallize has a special multiplier of 1.6. Then, any additive extra damage, such as the Quill-like bust from Eat Lua's burst, are added before taking into account enemy Geo res but not defense, crit, and elevation from constellations. For characters that have direct Lunar-Crystallize in their kit, it will generally be their main significant source of damage. Lastly, many things in the game that were enabled by triggering normal Crystallize have been updated to work with Lunar-Crystallize as well. Just to name a few key examples, Archaic Petra and Geo Resonance can be activated by triggering Lunar-Crystallize, and Navia's Shrapnel stacks can now be obtained through Lunar-Crystallize as well. And that's everything you need to know about Genshin's lunar reactions. If you found this guide helpful, consider liking the video or subbing to the channel so you don't miss out on similar types of videos in the future. Leave any questions you have in the comments, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.